Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this afternoon session. My name is Christabel Feeney and I am the Director of Employers for Change. I'm a white female with blue eyes and blonde brown hair, and this afternoon I'm wearing a long-sleeved black top and black trousers. I'm sitting with a purple background behind me with a white Employers for Change logo. Employers for Change is an employer disability information service providing advice and support to employers on the area of disability in order to empower them to recruit, employ and retain employees with disabilities. This afternoon, we will have a disability awareness training session with Adam Harris, CEO of AsIam. Adam has been a wonderful spokesperson and advocate for people with disabilities, particularly throughout the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. We are delighted to have him here this afternoon, and we know that he will be a fantastic speaker. And then we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. I would encourage people to either use the chat function, or if you wish, you can wait until the end and ask questions directly if you'd like to raise your hand. So without further ado, I'm delighted to pass over to Adam.
Thanks so much, Christabel. And just to follow your lead on this, my name is Adam. I'm a 26-year-old male. I have brown hair that's in desperate need of a haircut and looking forward to next week. I have hazel eyes. I'm wearing a blue check shirt and I'm sitting in my bedroom, and there's a number of photographs on the wall behind me. It's great to be here and to have a chance to talk to everybody today. And just at the outset, want to say a huge well done to Christabel and Jean and all the team in Employers for Change and the work that you've been doing in recent months since your launch. I know that it's something that a lot of people are really appreciating, and it's great to see. I've been given a challenging job today because disability is obviously a huge area that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And in 40 minutes, what I'm going to try and do is bring people on something of a whistle-stop tour around, I suppose, what it means to have a disability in Ireland, the challenges that can present in securing employment arising from being a disabled person. And then also, and I think this is critical, just a few top tips or food for thought about if you're starting out on this journey, considerations that you might want to make for your own workplace. What I'll say at the outset is I come to this issue as somebody who's from an autism background, who's an autistic person. I'm not an expert on every form of disability, so I hope I give a good overview that touches on, I suppose, takes maybe, as opposed to too much a specific disability approach, more a human approach about what it means to be disabled in Ireland. Because I think while we all come from different backgrounds and have different experiences, I think many of the barriers people face are very similar. And that's, I guess, the lens that I want to look through today. I think we're going to hopefully have a good 20 minutes to discuss together at the end. And what I'd say is during that time, feel free to ask me anything and to pull the conversation in whatever way you'd like to pull it. Can't promise I'll know the answer, but very open to any questions that you have. And I always think I kind of cover this in my presentation, but I always think it's a good rule of thumb when we're starting out these conversations. We're having this conversation today because we all want to learn more, because we want to remove barriers, because we want to increase understanding. Sometimes to get there, that means we have to ask questions we wish we didn't have to ask, or wish we already knew the answer to. It might mean we don't have the terminology we should have in order to talk about disability. But I think just during the questions and answers, please don't let that hold you back. Feel free to ask whatever it is you want to ask. And I think we'll all agree this is a safe space for people to do that. And whatever we say here, we'll kind of leave here. So just on that basis, I suppose to just maybe start with a little bit about where I'm coming from in the context of this conversation. This is a picture of me when I'm smaller, and my mom always says about me that I never do anything until I'm ready, and then I do it very quickly. And that started at birth because I was 18 days overdue and I was born in 25 minutes. And as you can see, I was quite a big baby. I was 9.5 pounds, and I believe children usually lose weight before they leave the hospital, but I actually gained weight, and they used to have to bring in 2 bottles and say these were for the twins. And the reason that's relevant is from the moment I was born, I had a massive attachment to my mom. She couldn't put me out of her arms for 2 seconds without me becoming very distressed. And of course, at first you just think that's a difficult baby. There's lots of those. But if you think about all those things you would look out for in a small child, the first time they walked, the first time they talked, the first time they played with the children, all of those things worked quite differently for me. And as a result, when it came time for me to go to preschool, I really wasn't able to manage interacting with other children at all. I found going to day-to-day environments like the supermarket, like like Montessori, like getting on a bus. Very, very stressful if there was too many people there, if people were talking at once, if there was too much happening in the environment. I would get very interested and really excel at things that I was interested in, but they wouldn't necessarily be things other children would be interested in. So that made it harder to make friends. And it also meant the traditional school system was quite challenging. And because I was having these differences, day-to-day life was very stressful. So on a day-to-day basis, I would become very distressed because I couldn't explain what I was experiencing, and my family didn't understand autism yet. So I was diagnosed with what was then called Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism, and there wasn't the level of support that there is in the education system today. So I spent the first 3 years of my education in special school until I was 8 years old, and moved to primary, and with the support of an SNA, had a really positive experience that enabled secondary school instantly. But I guess where it kind of becomes relevant to this conversation and the work that I did today, even though I come from a family that always very openly talked about autism and talked about it in a very positive way in terms of the strengths it can give you, how we need people to see the world, and it was autistic by the time I was maybe 12 or 13, to the point that I wouldn't even acknowledge that I was autistic. If someone tried to bring it up, I would get very, very annoyed. And the reason for that is I found that when people knew you were autistic, often with the very best of intentions, they would behave very differently around you. And sometimes that looked like people speaking just a little bit slower to you. Sometimes it meant people speaking just a little bit louder to you. Sometimes it meant people were actually overnight nearly patronizing because they wanted to be inclusive. So for a number of years, I really hated school and indeed when I was about 16 and began to do part-time jobs for the first time, I would never dream of telling anybody else that I was on the spectrum. And I used to think this was unique to me until I started blogging about my experiences because I was feeling isolated as a teenager. And what I found is that for many people who are autistic, and I think more disabilities more generally, there's something of a secret society where people know other people who have the same experience, the same diagnosis as ourselves, but people don't always feel they can talk about it. And one of the reasons they don't always feel they can talk about it is they're worried about being treated differently, or they're worried about people reacting badly. As a result of this, I decided when I was doing my Leaving Cert to set up AsIam to give autistic people a voice and to try and change the narrative around autism in Ireland. But I think what this fundamentally comes down to is thing, which is we said, let's move autistic people, let's move people with disabilities into the same schools as everybody else, the same communities as everybody else, the same workplaces as everybody else. But we won't talk about it because that would be uncomfortable. And the consequence is, if we don't talk about things, that's when so many barriers emerge. Knowledge is power. And the more we talk about disability, the more we recognize it as just another form of diversity within our society that we need to consider and plan for, the journey we can go on then to actually ensuring people can participate and be included in their community. So for the last 7 years, that's what AsIam has been all about. I won't bore you with what we do. You can learn more about it on our website, but put simply, we're Ireland's national autism charity. We do a lot of work in the area of providing supports to the autism community through information, advocacy and capacity building, and then also working directly with wider society. So we address autism not so much as a good thing or a bad thing or a disability, but rather we fundamentally see it as an accessibility issue. And we believe that autistic people have a lot to offer in the workplace, in school, in the community. We believe that autistic people adapt every day to do that, but it's only if other people adapt and meet us halfway that people are able to truly be included. So we do lots of work training employers, services, businesses, and you can learn more about that on our website. But what I want to explore to you today is, what is disability? Because I think disability is one of those areas where we come to the conversation with a lot of preconceptions, this barrier to somebody being able to actually obtain or secure employment. I want to just give some practical examples of the varied experience of disability and how that might play out in the workplace. I want to just talk about what are the barriers and the challenges for people in accessing work within Ireland. And then I just want to talk about how we can, I suppose, have the confidence to talk about this topic more openly and take the steps towards inclusive employment in your workplace, whether that be actively recruiting new members of staff. As you can see, that's a lot to cover in 40 minutes. So we're going to touch on these topics and hopefully it'll be a conversation starter as much as anything else. So what is disability? You know, I think there's that figure of speech that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And certainly in my experience, that's very much the case when it comes to disability. Because it's something maybe over the last 20 years or so, we've become more comfortable with, in the sense that it's definitely discussed more. I would suspect that nearly everybody now knows somebody who has a disability, whether it's an autism diagnosis and it's someone in your child's class, or whether it's a family member, a neighbor, somebody in your community. We can nearly all point to somebody we know, or if we can't, we can probably point to some TV personality, character, actor who has a diagnosis of a disability. So we're becoming much more comfortable with it in that sense, and much more aware of it. But a point that I always try and make is that there's a huge difference between being aware of something and understanding something. I'm aware that Mandarin is a language, but I don't understand it. So I'm not much use to anybody who only speaks that language. In the same way, I suppose, there's a lot of I often find when we don't know about something, it's very easy for misconceptions, rumors, old wives' tales to kind of stick on things, and they can create a huge amount of barriers. And there's loads of these misconceptions, but I just wanted to pick a couple at the start to kind of address. I think for a lot of people, when we talk about disability, and particularly because this is an employment event, straight away people's perception is, well, people with disabilities need to be looked after, need to be cared for. But certainly, they don't need support into employment. That's not what somebody with a disability needs. That can be further for the truth. And I believe that employment is something that gives everybody dignity. While it might look differently for different people, some people might want to work 40 hours a week, work a half a day a week. People with disabilities can be supported to make a contribution in the workplace. There can be a perception that people with disabilities are less capable, that because people have to do things in a different way, that they're somehow less able, less competent, less reliable than somebody who doesn't have a disability. And of course, this is a very flawed understanding of how there's a reality that within society, there's people who develop in a different way to other people, but this doesn't mean the person isn't able to do the same things, albeit sometimes in a different way. I think one of the biggest dangerous misconceptions from the point of view of employment is there's that sense of, well, I'm a very inclusive person. I'd love to hire someone who has a disability, but sure, I'd know if I did, and then I'd make the appropriate accommodations. But of course, the reality is most disabilities are hidden, and most people won't tell you that they have a disability. So we actually have to have the skills to proactively plan and proactively reach out and support people who want to come forward and want to ask for accommodations. Only a very small number of people are affected by disability. I'll just take the community that I know best, the autism community. 1 in 65 people in school today has a diagnosis of autism. Now think about that in the context of your life. Everybody you know, we all know hundreds of people, and yet most people maybe think they know one autistic person. So there's the reality that maybe we can point to one person we know who maybe will be the person with very, very high support needs, for example, but we're not realizing that actually this is such a common occurrence. We're interacting with people with various different disabilities right throughout every day of our lives. And then I think this is another key one when it comes to the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and changing how we understand disabilities. There can be a perception that people with disabilities should have to do all of the hard work, that if you're a person with a disability, that you need to adapt to fit into the bigger picture. What most people don't realize is that people with disabilities have to put in massive energy to do the most simple things that other people don't have to think to at all. That people with disabilities, autistic people, are adapting every day, but it's only if other people meet halfway that you can have that true inclusion. And that's really what we want to talk about today. So just having looked at some of those misconceptions, what are actually the facts when we talk about disability? Fundamentally, from my point of view, disability is a form of diversity within society. So just as we have people from different cultures, different genders, different sexualities, different religions, it's reasonable to expect in a world of billions and billions of people, there's going to be people who develop and do things in a different way to the majority of the population. And there is different categories of disability, and different agencies and organizations will group them in different ways. I wanted to address them in a particular way today. One form of diversity within the disability community is neurodiversity, and that's a term that I think we're hearing more and more and becoming more comfortable with. And it is this idea that naturally in brain processes, there's going to be a certain degree of divergence across society. The reality is we're all neurodivergent. However, most people are close enough to an average, if you like, that society works. Whereas for some of us, that divergence is greater, and as a result, day-to-day life can take more active energy because you're thinking differently to a majority of people. So when we're talking about neurodiversity, we're talking about people who may be autistic, who may have another developmental condition like ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia. Perhaps we're talking about somebody with a learning disability or someone who has mental health differences. We could be talking about a sensory disability, perhaps somebody who is blind or has a visual impairment, somebody who is deaf, for example. We could be talking about a physical disability, somebody who uses a wheelchair or somebody who has other physical access needs as they go about day-to-day life. We could be talking about somebody who has a medical condition that debilitates them in certain aspects of their life and means they need certain accommodations to be able to manage in the workplace. But I think the really important thing when we think about this, and it's very different to other forms of diversity. So whereas my experience of disability is something that I've been born with and I've grown up with my whole life, indeed, for many people who are neurodiverse, it's a fundamental part of who you are and how you see the world. It's not something that could ever be removed. However, for other people, I think what's interesting about the disability community as a minority group within society, it's a community that you can be born into, as I was, but it's also a community that you could join at any moment. And many people, as they get older, develop, for example, sensory impairments, develop physical impairments that mean they need accommodations within the workplace. So recognizing disability as something that occurs within society and planning for it in a human rights-based way is actually in everybody's interest, because many people at one stage in their lives or another will have some of these disabilities or these differences that will require accommodations and support. In our old world understanding of disability, we made it all about the person and how we needed to, change the person. And what I think there's now a realization of is that, yes, because of how some people are born, and I'll use the example of neurodiversity, where you have a person diverging from how the majority of people think, that in and of itself, of course, can present challenges that the person needs support in. So, for example, if you're an autistic person, you may need support to learn how to understand how other people communicate. However, it's a little bit like an iceberg, and this is an analogy I really like. Sometimes those differences are the ones we can see, but sometimes the much greater barriers are those ones just beneath the surface. So if people think about an iceberg, think about the film Titanic, you can see that piece of ice just above the surface, but there's a lot more ice beneath the surface that's really propping up those challenges and making them a problem. And what those challenges can be is environmental barriers. So how society happens to operate, how your office happens to operate, and how that interacts with somebody who happens to use a wheelchair, who happens to be autistic, who happens to have a visual impairment. And in attitudinal barriers. And I sometimes think when we talk about these three areas, personal characteristics, environmental barriers, and attitudinal barriers, people might think that attitude is the least barrier. Is that something I just threw in at the end? But when you speak to people who have lived experience, the greatest barrier people will often describe is the attitude of other people. The classic example is in an interview situation. In a recent survey AsIam did with irishjobs.ie, 75% of autistic people wouldn't tell their employer that they have a diagnosis of autism. And one of the reasons for that is when I come in and I sit at an interview table, I don't know if the person on the other side of it had seen maybe a really inaccurate portrayal of autism, like Rain Man, for example, and that's their understanding. Or is it somebody who's an uncle of somebody who's autistic, who's very, very positive in this area? So often those misconceptions I spoke about at the start can actually prevent a lot of people from being able to participate, from being able to access the workplace. So what's important is that for people with disabilities, there's lots of people doing a lot of work to deal with the personal characteristics and to manage that and to learn to understand a world that isn't really built with us in mind. But what's really important is that accommodations are made to make the environment and the people in it supportive of that person as well. And those accommodations can look very different for different people. It may be that somebody needs to sit in a quiet part of the office because the noise levels in the office are just too loud. It may mean that the person needs access to certain software so that they're able to complete their tasks on a day-to-day basis. Often there'll be very, very small changes that other people won't even notice, that may not even cost a great deal of money. But putting these accommodations in place levels the playing field and enables everybody to share the space and to progress. One of the things that I just wanted to come back to is you can't always see disability. The majority of disabilities you're going to encounter in the workplace are going to be hidden disabilities. And I think one of the challenges at times can be that people what might then expect if somebody came to tell them that they needed certain supports or accommodations, that it's going to be a big, deep, meaningful conversation. It might often be nothing like that. It might be somebody saying to you, listen, I really can't deal with the noise levels in the office. I'm finding it really challenging because two different managers are giving me instructions at once. I don't know which instruction I should prioritize. It might be a person saying that, you know, the interview location isn't suitable for me. Can you make an alternative arrangement? People won't always use the word disability, and people won't always look any different to anybody else. And just to really illustrate this point, this is a slide I often use in my talks about autism, and every single person on this slide is autistic, and yet every person is totally different. You'll see people who have other diagnoses as well as autism. You'll see people who are men, women, older, younger, every nationality, in different settings, but all autistic. So it's really, really important to realize that whatever your image of disability is in your head, I'm not even saying it's a bad thing, because it's often a reference point for you, but it's important to open up your mind and realize that it's particularly important when we're talking about things that we cannot see. It's very easy for us to dismiss somebody who's asking for an accommodation as just being demanding, because when we can't see something, it's easy for us to think it's not actually there. But the barriers that people can face, even though they're invisible, can be every bit as significant. One of the biggest chilling factors, I think, for a lot of employers, and again, this really bore out recently in our survey about autism and employment that we did with Irish Jobs, is finding the right word. And sometimes people's fear about this can be actually enough to firmly believe most people would never want to cause any sort of offence to somebody with a disability at all. But what I think is important is that we don't allow that really decent desire to outweigh the fact that we need to learn, and we need to have conversations, and we need to make sure that we can have the information we need, that everybody can be included. So language and disability can be challenging. How do I ask somebody what they prefer to be called? What if I use the wrong word and I cause offence? And I'm just using one example here on my slide. Different people within the disability community can have different preferences for language. Some people, often parents, it must be said, prefer for their child to be described as a person with autism. And that's because they say, well, they're my little boy or my little girl first, and they just happen to have them. Isn't something like a coffee cup that you can pick up and put down. It's fundamentally part of who you are and how you see the world. And it's a positive thing, like being Irish, for example. So many autistic people feel really strongly about saying autistic person. However, if in doubt, a good starting point is simply to use the person's name, because the person is a person like anybody else. When you're interacting with somebody with a disability, it's a good idea to find out what their preferred terminology is, and it will be different for everybody. But for me, the most important things are always intention. You know, when we're having a conversation, when we're learning from each other, we're going to make mistakes along the way. So certainly when I'm interacting with someone, the most important thing is, what's their intention? Are they trying to be supportive? Are they trying to be inclusive? If I give them feedback and say, I'd prefer if you said this as opposed to this, are they going to respond well to that? So I think it's important we don't allow language to trip us up or to prevent us having a conversation. I think the other thing that's important to bear in mind when we talk about language is there's two things that we could do straight away that would make a difference. And that is to, when we're speaking about disability, to speak about it in a positive way. And that's much more than just autistic or person with autism. Are we describing individuals? Are we talking about strengths? Are we talking about this in a positive way or in a legalistic way? The other thing that I think we can do is make sure that, just as there's words we would never dream of using in the workplace about women, about people of other nationalities, there's still words we use in day-to-day life in our vernacular language that are extremely oppressive of people with disabilities. I'm thinking of the R word, for example, and I'm thinking of the S word. There's a lot we could do to remove those sort of pieces of about in an inclusive way. So if you're kind of considering being an inclusive employer, you want to start out this journey within your workplace, I think there's some simple steps you can take as a starting point. The first thing is, it's really important to not see this as charity. While different people with disabilities will be able to fill different roles within your business, this is about identifying who those people are and what the needs of your business are and matching those. We're not talking about charity, and perhaps when we talk about disability in this way, that's really when we actually prevent us making opportunities. People with disabilities want to read about being seen as the token person with a disability. So we need to talk about this in a mainstream way. It's about equity, not equality. And I think this is a very important point to make. Sometimes people will be concerned about, we have to treat everybody the same way. Sometimes in life, we have to treat some people in a slightly different way, not to give people an advantage, but actually to level the playing field. And this might be in an interview, having to make a reasonable accommodation. It might be having to allow somebody to work from home when we get back into the office 2 days a week so that they're able to work full time. It might be allowing a person to wear a particular item of clothing that isn't in the uniform policy because they've sensory difficulties with the other form of clothing. So equity is not about treating everybody the same. It's about making sure that everybody has the same opportunities. I think what's very important is nothing about us without us. And I think within every workplace, the beauty is there's probably already people who have disabilities. There's already family members of people who have disabilities. And the more we can do to involve people in those discussions and actually let people provide leadership in this area within workplaces, I think the bigger difference that will make. I think it's very important that we don't talk about diversity and inclusion here and disability over here. It has to be a mainstream part of the discussion that we plan for within workplaces. Disability inclusion should come up in every discussion in the workplace, whether it's about the staff handbook, recruitment policies, career progression. Disability should be part of that conversation. What I would say to people is, we know disclosure is a huge issue and we have to respect that. Different people will feel comfortable disclosing, other people will not. It's a deeply personal choice and that ought to be respected. So stream as much support as you can. So the sorts of accommodations that might help somebody, for example, being able to choose where you sit in the office. Is that possible to be a choice that's available to every member of staff when they come in? Are there other supports that could be made available to anyone who requests them without having to give a diagnosis, so that next level up? Can you widely advertise support so that individualized might be more bespoke to that person? Are you actively communicating in a positive way that disability is accepted, that there is supports available, and how you can go about accessing those and doing that disclosure? I think it's really important to give the person a sense of control, that the person knows that if they wish to disclose or share their experiences with you, that they're going to guide how that conversation works. What often people are worried about, I actually had someone who worked with me before, this is what worked for them, so that's what we're going to do for you. It's important that the person's able to guide the conversation, and only the accommodations the person needs at any given time are the ones that are made. And critically, know that there's support out there. There's many ways supports, there's government supports, there's not enough, but there are supports out there that many businesses don't know about. And it's really important to let you know that you don't have to go this alone. And there's many NGOs and government bodies who want to work with you in going out on this journey. Because there's no doubt there's a real urgency to this conversation, has a disability. So this is a major group of people who are disproportionately affected. We have the lowest rate of employment within the disability community in Europe. And there's a real growing concern, because if we just take, again, the autism community, but this is true of a lot of cohorts of disability groups, we're seeing the first generation of young people diagnosed in large numbers as children, who in many cases have now attended mainstream school, and demographically they're aging out in huge numbers over the next number of years. So it's absolutely vital that we have this conversation now. We can't move quick enough before this crisis gets any worse. We know that there's a very strong business case that employers who hire people with disabilities say it benefits the bottom line, say they have better retention rates, say it's good for staff morale and recruitment. But we also know that many employers don't feel confident or know where to start. And that's a major piece of where we need to bridge the gap. There is a plethora of legal protections and policies for people within the workplace. But again, it's one thing having laws and strategies, it can be another thing sometimes seeing them implemented. But one of the things that I would like to highlight is that, is COVID-19 a major opportunity for us? Because I think 18 months ago, the workplace worked a particular way and looked a particular way. And if you tried to suggest that it would work in a different way, that was seen as hugely disruptive. But so much of what we took for granted about the world of work over the last 18 months has been completely thrown into the air. And what's amazing is the sky hasn't fallen in. Just to give you one example, many members of the autism community who experience underemployment feel they would be able to work full time if, after the lockdown ends, it's possible for the person to continue to work maybe 2 days a week from home. So yes, having the structure, going to the office, meeting people, but actually that can be so exhausting, getting the bus 5 days a week, meeting people 5 days a week, sitting in a busy office 5 days a week. That isn't always sustainable in the long run. But if the person could do that 2 or 3 days a week and work at home 2 or 3 days a week, that could be enough for a person to have career stability for their entire career. So we have to make sure we don't miss this major opportunity to make our workplaces more inclusive. So just to close, I just wanted to take you through, in terms of the different areas of an employer's journey. I think what's really important is when we talk about disability and understanding disability within the workplace, we're not just talking about recruitment. That's really the start of the journey, as opposed to, you know, the destination. So we need to be thinking about where are the different actions we can take across an employee's lifetime in a business to make sure that we can include and support the person successfully. So I think that really does start when we take out the piece of paper and we talk about hiring the person. And there's a few things I would think that are, at this stage, it's really important to realize where you advertise. Where are you actually advertising your available posts? Not every person with a disability is on jobs at websites every day of the week, because often the person has had a lot of negative experiences. Are you reaching out to NGOs who might be working with people with disabilities? Are you going through special interest groups where maybe a person is affiliated? Are you making sure that where you post on social media, that those postings are accessible? How you advertise is really important as well. And for example, in terms of the photography you're using, is that inclusive? And is it made very clear what a typical day will work like? Because that might be very important for some people. What are you advertising? In order to create an inclusive workplace, we need more than Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. We need a range of opportunities that allow for people who only want to work part-time, maybe people who only want to work a very small number of hours every week. Who is advertising? Is there people with disabilities involved in the recruitment processes? Have the people who are going to run the recruitment process received training in disability so that they're aware of the sort of issues that they need to take into account? When you're actually putting in certain skills, characteristics, qualifications into your recruitment piece, are you making sure that everything there is absolutely necessary? For example, within the autism community, we have scattered skill sets. The gap between what a person's good at and bad at can be much greater. However, very often in job descriptions, we put in the core things we really need, but then we add in a lot of very general stuff, you know, about you must be good communicator, good at working in teams, good at working by yourself, naturally motivated. Stuff that may have very little to do with this particular role, and that can be enough to instantly exclude. And then finally, the process, how you're going to run the recruitment process. Will that be inclusive at every step of the journey? When we talk about recruitment, I spend a lot of my time designing autism-friendly processes and organizations and procedures. If you were to ask me to design something that wasn't autism-friendly, I would probably pick a typical recruitment process, because it's based on building rapport with strangers, dealing with the unknown, and answering abstract questions. And I think they can be challenges for many different disability groups. Very often, the traditional interview is not the best way to find the best candidate, and it often isn't the best way to empower people with disabilities. But if that is the route you want to take, is there certain things that you can do to support the person? Can you make sure, for example, the person knows what to expect in advance? Can you ensure that maybe the person has questions written out as opposed to just spoken verbally? Can you make sure that the environment is calm and supportive, that the waiting area is that little bit easier to manage? Can you make sure the person has an opportunity to show you they can do the job as opposed to just tell you that they can do the job? Would it be possible to offer internships or on-the-job training for somebody who might really thrive when they get to actually experience the workplace in practice? When you ask on your form, do you have a disability? Is that where you stop? Because many people will never answer that, because they'll think I'm actually being weeded out of the process, or they'll think that's a really personal information. I was bullied in school for being autistic. My last employer didn't realize what to do for an autistic person. What will happen if I put it here? it's really important that you write about disability in a positive way and you describe the sort of supports that might be possible if a person discloses. Because if not, why would I trust such a personal piece of information with other people? And are there plans in place to appropriately support disclosure if it happens at the end of the interview or after a person's been appointed? It's really important that managers and colleagues receive training, and sometimes that training needs to be very specific for an individual, because what will be important for one person with a disability won't be important for another. But I think what it's also important to understand is it's not just about a 2-hour training session. It's about making sure it's a workplace. Workplaces now have amazing ERGs and all of that sort of stuff. Are disability a fundamental part of that? I think it's really important to plan for and regularly review appropriate accommodations with an employee. A person may not always know what they need, and they may need support and practical examples around what might be available. It's also the case that what a person thinks they might need and what they need in practice can be a difference. So it can't just be one conversation, it has to be an ongoing conversation. Certainly for our community, the biggest barrier in the workplace can often be nothing to do with your contract of employment, your staff handbook, or getting the job done. It can be all that stuff that we never write down that are integral to our workplaces. You know, what do we do when it's somebody's birthday in work? What are the subjects we're allowed to talk about or not talk about in the workplace? If we go on holidays, is there any customs about bringing a box of sweets back or whatever it might be? Very, very often there's particular workplace expectations and workplace cultures that are never documented because they're obvious to most people. They may not be obvious to every person with a disability. And so it's really important that we mainstream the discussion of those. Clear communication and opportunities to ask for support. That might mean having access to a mentor who's on your same level as opposed to somebody who's just more senior. It may mean having just one line manager, so there's a really clear line of communication. For some people, it might mean it'd be easier for instructions to be written out as opposed to spoken to verbally. But critically, it's important that even if a person says no to support at the start, that there's opportunities to access support beyond that date if the person decides they would like to. What I think is also important is to think about employee assistance programs. Not all of them always cover the sort of supports people with disabilities need. And just one example of that can be accessing adult diagnosis for autistic people. It's extremely expensive, can make a massive difference, particularly in terms of having confidence in the workplace. But you're talking €1,500 or €850, depending on where you go to do that privately. Is there a way that the employee assistance program can plan to provide supports that people with disabilities might need as well? In terms of career progression, I think that's another kind of important piece of the puzzle that we shouldn't forget. Because I think, you know, it's people don't just want to get entry-level jobs, people do want to have careers as well. And to be it, I have to see it, and we need to have more role models within the workplace. The only way we'll create those role models is giving people the chance to progress and also creating environments in which people feel comfortable sharing their story. That said, it is very important to be person-centered as well. I know many people within my community who don't always want to be forced to the next promotion, feel really comfortable in the role they're doing, and a sudden change isn't always as supportive as people might think it is. So it has to be person-centered, and it has to be in consultation with other people. I think one of the challenges can be with career progression that some of the steps you have to take can be very much built with non-disabled lenses in mind. So maybe, for example, there's a real expectation that you'll get very involved socially in the company. Maybe as a young professional, there's a need for you to really proactively join a lot of things, go to a lot of events. But if you're a person with a disability, you might be exhausted at the end of the day and you might want to go out after work. If you're an autistic person, you might find those social occasions very, very intensive. So we need to make sure that the pathways we've laid out for career progression are inclusive for everybody. But also, I think what's important to understand, and we see this a lot, is that the needs of somebody in the workplace at a given time can change. So, you know, there can be a person who's been maybe needed some support and maybe a key manager leaves, and maybe somebody dies in their family, and all of a sudden the person's needs change quite quickly. So it's important that there's a kind of constant check-ins about what people might need at any given time. And it's important to realize that anyone may need supports at some point in their career. And certainly, again, from the point of view of autism, we're seeing more and more people in their 40s and 50s who've maybe masked their experience for a long period of time, who've never asked anybody for help, and who've maybe taken that burden of doing all of the adapting. And it's maybe only now, 20, 30 years into their career, they're coming forward and saying, I have got a diagnosis, or I do need support. And it's important to realize, just as a person who may acquire a disability at some stage in their career or at some stage in their life, we need to recognize that anyone can start to need supports or ask for supports at some stage in their career, and that should be acceptable. So that's just some of my very high level thinking around how we can grow to a greater understanding of disability, how we can have more confidence in discussing it, and some of the considerations that your business might like to take into consideration as you go on this journey. But thank you for listening to me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation now.
Thanks, Adam. That was brilliant. Really, really, really good. There's a bit of a conversation going on here at the moment in the chat box, and I think it's around kind of the recruitment processes. So somebody had said, if a person with a disability is treated differently during an interview, then all candidates do not have the same process. So I think that comes back to, you know, your conversation around equity versus equality.
Well, I can kind of comment on that. I think it depends on what the accommodation is, because in some instances the accommodation may not provide any advantage whatsoever. So, for example, if somebody needs a sign language interpreter at interview, it doesn't mean somebody who is not deaf needs a sign language interpreter at interview, and that provides no advantage to that candidate. There are other things that we would do that do enable a person to do their best, but I would acknowledge perhaps maybe can confer some advantage. And what our approach to that has been, well, why don't we just give it to everybody? Because if we want to have an interview process that's the best candidate at the end, if we can create an interview process that enables everybody to be relaxed, to not feel they're being caught out, and to give as much information as they can, that's a good thing. So in AsIam, we've half of our team is autistic. That's 7 people presently, and we have a protocol we use around the interviews that's quite detailed. So it's everything from a person gets a visual guide and they say, we'll be in touch. We, for example, don't allow our people on our interview panels to wear strong fragrances, because that can be enough to throw an autistic person. We give an assignment so a person can show us what they can do, as opposed to, but we actually give that to everybody who comes to the interview. It's not just people who disclose that they're autistic. I don't have a disability at the end of the process. That was the most positive experience we've ever had, even if they didn't get the job. So I think that there's some accommodation. There's other accommodations, like, for example, giving the interview questions so people can process them, that may be seen to. And I think if in doubt, what's the harm in giving everybody that opportunity? As an interviewer, how would you suggest during an interview to make a candidate feel safe, and in case that he or she feels good, to talk about disabilities? You know, I think, to be honest, my first reaction to that is a huge amount. There's probably 2 layers to it. A huge amount of that has to be done before the person ever reaches the interview. And I think a lot of that can come through in the information you provide to a candidate in preparing to come to interview, knowing that you can ask for help, explaining what accommodations are available, providing a point of contact, reducing the unknown. But I think more generally, when we recognize that not everyone will disclose, I think it's more just about having empathy. So when you see a person struggling, really making very clear to them that it's okay if they want to ask for a question to be rephrased, if they want to take a break. So I think it's about how we respond to people when maybe they become distressed or overwhelmed within an interview. But I think a lot of the work has to be done long before a person ever arrives for interview, because I think it's about that you want the person arriving on the day as relaxed as they can and as best able to tell their story as they can.
And then there's another one here about any tips for interviews being conducted online.
Yeah, I think that's you see, I think this is the great complexity of disability, because everybody is so different. What can be the best support in the world for one person can be absolutely a nightmare for another person. So I know, for example, even just within the autism community, because that's some people I've been talking to, some people have found being able to interview online really empowering, because people are saying, if I have to travel into the city centre to do an interview, I'm so overstimulated by the time I get to reception that it's a big challenge. The fact that I can be in the comfort of my bedroom, in my, having everything in the environment the way I like it, I can perform much better. And there's also maybe not in the interview, there's that split second at the start where you're making small talk or there's handshakes. There's none of that maybe perhaps in the same way if it's an online interview. However, other people can find it very stressful. And one of the reasons why I think that can be the case can be there's a certain degree of, I guess, when you arrive at another interview, you're not in control at all. The process runs, whereas you're very subject to outside factors like dogs and phones and internet connections. And I think that can cause a lot of problems. For me, I think, again, coming back to the idea that COVID-19 might be a challenge and an opportunity, I think what we need to maybe look at is, if we know it works really well for somebody, could there be the future and could there be the piece in the future of offering a range of choice? I think where online interviews can also be helpful is, for some people, the phone is a huge difficulty and can be much more reassuring being able to see somebody. So I'd like to think because we've gotten so good at using Zoom, that we might be able to ditch phone interviews, because that thing of when a person doesn't know when their phone is going to ring, they can't see the other person's reaction. I'd like to think we can maybe phase them out.
Thanks so much, Adam. It was absolutely fantastic. I think everybody who has been on this today, found it really, really useful and really insightful.